Welcome to New York, Quebec, and the water route to the center of the world. Today's bonus episode is entitled Pinkster, the rediscovery of a Hudson Valley cultural tradition. I'd like to thank the friends of Philipse Manor Hall for their support of this podcast moving forward and invite everyone down to the Manor this Saturday, May 10th from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. at our Yonkers location for our very own Pinkster Festival. See the show notes for a link to further information. Now let's examine what was once a major part of the Hudson Valley calendar year, a time of merriment and reunion, but most of all it was a time of freedom. Pinksteren, or the Pentecostal celebration, developed into a summer Hudson Valley festival by the early 18th century. Often shortened to Pinkster by enslaved Africans, this was a role reversal celebration that allowed for familial gatherings of the enslaved. This religious celebration quickly became a stronghold of Dutch Afro culture, taking on a carnival-like atmosphere found in Catholic countries and complete with organized crews or guilds. These would be responsible for things such as parades and displays. Such organizations could still be found in Albany throughout the 19th century. Every great Hudson Valley manor would be the setting for such raucous festivities, with both Dutch slave owners and freedmen joining in. This was juxtaposed with the quiet, emotional reunions of enslaved kin not seen for months or even years. Dr. Nicole Maskiell argues that it was the Dutch merchant class that drove the expansion of slavery within the intertwined familial patroon networks of the Hudson Valley. She bases this off of the escalating series of restrictions placed on African slaves and freed people of color after the English takeover. It's within this argument that we can glimpse the transitional phase of the Dutch merchants to landed English gentry, but I do not believe that credit can be solely assigned to the former Dutch of New Netherland alone. It's their unique contacts with smuggling entrepôts of the Caribbean and Africa that get melded onto this burgeoning English empire. They are no longer fighting against the navigation acts, but let's say operating along its boundaries now. The British view the region as prime plantation potential, and supported by rent-paying tenant farmers, slave labor was an obvious component of this proto-industrial rural production. The restrictions placed on the enslaved aren't the result of the former Dutch merchants' penchant for such drastic racial measures, but instead a creation of an expanding slave society and headed by a polyglot Dutch Anglo-Scot landed aristocracy. The Society of New Netherland could have developed along the same lines in terms of the widespread use of slaves on the patroons' manors, but a large-scale settler colony wasn't the main focus until it was too late. Under English rule, the experiences of Barbados, Jamaica, and Virginia due to Bacon's Rebellion had led to the implementation of hierarchical racial codes that defined roles and boundaries within colonial New York society. While it's true that many former Dutch elite were incorporated into the reformed colonial New York government, they were influenced by events and established practice elsewhere in the New World. Dutch slavery varied drastically depending on the geographic location. This isn't to be confused with the actual daily state of being held in bondage. The Hudson Valley was quite different from northern Brazil, Berbice, or Curaçao. Each specific area lended itself to a particular type of economic production, climate, and both competing indigenous and European players. Experience in one particular environment could color one's views on slavery upon entering another. Both WIC employees and the various global refugees that populated Dutch New World possessions also brought experiences from Africa and even Asia to the table. The industrial-sized sugar production of northern Brazil and the isolation of the wild coast plantations produced harsh outcomes in the tropical disease-ridden environment, but hardened racial attitudes developed in a small white Dutch population under siege by their enslaved. The loss of northern Brazil brought these hardened racial attitudes to the slaving entrepot of Curaçao. These contacts would greatly influence the Dutch merchant class of a transitioning New York. Conditional freedom grants, right to petition, wages, and even land grants were clawed back in the first 2 decades of English rule. This was directly supported by the newly minted Dutch landed gentry, whose unique mercantile contacts from their old ties to the Dutch overseas empire helped them nicely skirt the parameters of the navigation acts. In researching Pinkster, it's so important to view it through an Atlantic basin-wide lens, where syncretism is not only occurring through one-way exchanges. Take, for instance, the majority of the slave base of New Netherland. Most were of Angolan or Brazilian origin. This group of enslaved would have already been influenced by the Iberian Catholic festival traditions. Evidence that some sort of Portuguese Creole was the lingua franca of the enslaved in New Netherland has emerged from scrutiny of court cases where interpreters are called for black litigants and whose communication isn't quite European or fully African. Author Jeroen Dewulf believes it most closely resembled the modern papiamento, found on the Dutch ABC Islands today. Further evidence shows that many inhabitants of New Netherland had familiarity with Portuguese from their time in the northern Dutch-held areas of Brazil. Slave importation to the colony of New Netherland was coming primarily from the Portuguese and Spanish networks, and the names of the enslaved lean heavily toward such origins. This blended Afro-European culture would travel across the ocean and influence a new Afro-European interaction, this time between the Protestant Dutch and the captured Afro-Iberian slaves taken from their foes. Deep traditions of May pagan celebrations and medieval Christian late spring fairs, centered 50 days after Easter, provided the cultural foundations the Dutch would lay down in the Hudson Valley. Author Jeroen Dewulf argues that celebrations like Sinterklaas and the Pinkster Kermis or Fair were just Catholic rituals that had been allowed to carry on from the Protestant Reformation, as long as they dropped overt signs of Catholic worship. Contact between Spain and Africa brought Moorish roles and displays to these Pentecostal or Whitsun celebrations by the mid-1400s in the Low Countries. During the traditional Catholic period before Lent and leading up to Shrovetide or Mardi Gras, New Netherland settlers placed and decorated maypoles or paraded through the streets on charivari missions. This was essentially a raunchy roast of a soon-to-be-married couple or targeted an individual for some well-deserved scorn. Large multi-day free market fairs, that corresponded to ones found in Amsterdam at the time, were held in New Netherland. Young girls were dressed in white linens and crowned with flowers. These Pinkster Blummetjie would go on to lead the processions around towns. Some popular games played included cat clubbing, consisting of a cat imprisoned in a cask and suspended from a rope. The participants would throw wooden clubs at the cask until the winner freed the cat. The second one is called pulling the goose, and this consisted of a goose hung upside down with its neck greased. Suspended by rope across the road, a rider would gallop at full speed and attempt to pull the gooseneck free. Another game of skill was called Shoot the Parrot, where participants would attempt to target a wooden mock-up of the bird for points. Most mysteriously, we do not have a single archival colonial document in English attesting to the celebration of Pinkster in the Hudson Valley. This I attribute to the insular nature of the Dutch circling the wagons in an effort to counter the prevailing Anglo-centric world being thrust upon them. It's also quite possible that the 1911 Capitol fire consumed any document that might have provided an observation, as we lost the vast majority of the English colonial era documentation. The following is a 1655 Dutch document that rails against the party-like atmosphere and the traditions that seem a bit too Catholic for either the Reformed Church or WIC leadership. The Director General and Council of New Netherland, to all those who hear or see this read, greetings. Whereas experience has demonstrated and instructed that on New Year and May days, with the shooting, maypole planting, and excessive drinking, besides unnecessarily wasting powder, much drunkenness and other insolences are committed, in addition to other sad accidents leading many times to injuries. Therefore, in order to prevent such in the future, the Director General and Council expressly forbid henceforth shooting and planting of maypoles on New Year and May days within this province of New Netherland. Also, any noise-making with drums or dispensing of any wine, brandy, or beer upon those occasions, and this only to prevent further accidents and trouble, for a fine of 12 guilders for the first time, doubled for the second time, and arbitrary punishment for the third time, 1/3 for the officer, and 1/3 for the poor, and 1/3 for the accuser. Furthermore, they order all inferior courts in this province to publish and post this in the usual places, and to execute it promptly. Thus done at the session of the Director General and Council at Fort Amsterdam in New Netherland, dated the end of December 1655. Dewulf recounts the story of the famous abolitionist sojourner Truth's Afro-Dutch heritage, originally called Isabella Baumfree. She writes of yearning to return to her Dutch master to experience the joys of Pinkster once again. While her dreams are sometimes interpreted as prophecies of her delivering powers, Dewulf sees her master's retrieval of her as a reflection of the actual role reversal practice, also anchored in the typical call to awakening practiced back in the Netherlands and carried on to the New World. In essence, Pinkster represents a time when agency could be exerted and the master's role reversed to serve, so Sojourner's recollection is one of joy. Seeing the preparations for Carnival on Curaçao and knowing the traditions of Mardi Gras in the Western Hemisphere, I always thought that Pinkster and Carnival closely resembled each other. It's fascinating to get the cultural and historic continuity through practices in the Netherlands. There's both a retaining of the old Catholic way and a whitewashing of any overt connection to such, but the authorities just can't seem to get the ordinary folks to drop their love of the overall festival season. This is transplanted to the New World in the form of Pinkster, and transformed again by contact with enslaved Africans, who reinforced their own syncretic Ibero-Afro background. Slaves were usually given 3 days off to celebrate the festival, including a period of a week before in order to prepare, moving about at night and practicing drum sets. James Fenimore Cooper provides a description in his book Satanstow. The next day was the first of the 3 that are devoted to Pinkster, the great Saturnalia of New York blacks. Although this festival is always kept with more vivacity in Albany than in York, it is far from being neglected, even now, in the latter place. After showing Jason the City Hall, Trinity Church, and the City Tavern, we went out of town, taking the direction of a large common that of the king's officers had long used as a parade ground, and which has since been called the Park, though it would be difficult to say why, since it is barely a paddock in size, and certainly has never been used to keep any animals wilder than boys of the town. Jason was at first confounded with the noises, dances, music, and games that were going on. By this time 9/10 of the blacks of the city, and of the whole country within 30 or 40 miles indeed, were collected in thousands in those fields, beating banjos and singing African songs. The features that distinguished a Pinkster frolic from the usual scenes at fairs and other merrymakings, however, were of African origin. It is true there is not now, nor were there then many blacks among us of African birth, but traditions and usages of their original country were so far preserved as to produce a marked difference between this festival and one of European origin. Among other things, some were making music by beating on skins drawn over the ends of hollow logs, while others were dancing to it, in a manner to show that they felt infinite delight. This in particular was said to be a usage of their African progenitors. Hundreds of whites were walking through fields as amused spectators. Markets were set up near to African communities in many of the Hudson Valley's urban centers. Albany hosted one of the largest gatherings on a hill that was transformed into an amphitheater. An 1803 article in the Albany Sentinel states, "The camp is built in the following manner. A number of long stakes are stuck into the ground enclosing the space intended to be occupied as bower. Between these stakes pine bush is woven, and the covering is of the same material, sometimes woven and sometimes thrown loosely over cross sticks or rafters. These arbors are divided into different apartments, filled up with seats and stored with fruit, cakes, cheese, beer, and liquors of various kinds. In the center of this villa and in front of the royal arbor, a sort of amphitheater is laid out, where the guinea dance is to be performed." The basic premise of the dance was to construct a circular formation from which paired couples would enter the internal space to perform to the best of their abilities or fulfill a role in the narrative. This dance was called the Toto by the enslaved participants, harking back to a possible association with the god Totau, but nothing conclusive has ever surfaced to back up this link. Marshall Stearns, in his work entitled The Story of Jazz, theorizes that these dances could actually have a double meaning, part of which was to mock the white slaveholders and also communicate important messages. He's developed this theory from an examination of practices in New Orleans, where the term toto is translated as backside. A large procession led by a chosen king started off the festivities, joined by everyone except the wealthy slave owners. The king was elected and campaigned vigorously to hold the position via his social organizational skills and charity. Much of this was organized around confraternities that harkened back to medieval Iberian Catholic brotherhoods. Vendors had to pay a tax to the king's purse or be expelled from the celebrations. In this way, the king could both help pay for future festivals and continue his important patronage system with the African community. Some kingships seem to be hereditary according to historian Jeroen Dewulf. The story of Albany's King Charles is a great example. Charles was the star of an 1803 Albany newspaper report, and it seemed that he was owned by the Dow family, a prominent household that dated back to New Netherland, and whose members were counted amongst the Albany elite. Charles's master Volkert served as both mayor of Albany and represented the state as a senator. He was accused of being spooked before the Battle of Saratoga, riding back to Albany and claiming that his master was being pursued by the British on the road. He was also cited for his athletic ability and bravery, being the subject of a dangerous high-stakes horse race with General Philipse Schuyler on his master's horse. The race took place during the winter on the ice-covered Hudson. Charles is cited as winning and introduced to the readership via his Pinkster King connections. Robert J. Dam provides evidence of Charles' skills of oration, taken from an 1867 work by James Eights entitled Pinkster Festivities in Albany 60 Years Ago. The hour of 10 having now arrived, and the assembled multitude being considered most complete, A deputation was then selected to wait upon their venerable sovereign king, Charlie of the Pinkster Hill, with the intelligence that his respectful subjects were congregated and were anxiously desirous to pay all proper homage to his majesty their king. He was tall, thin, and athletic, and although the frost of nearly 70 winters had settled on his brow, its chilling influence had not yet extended to his bosom, and he still retained all the vigor and agility of his younger years. Such were his manly attributes at this present time. Pinkster celebrations were documented from Sag Harbor on the western end of Long Island all the way through the Mohawk River Valley. Charles's duties were not exclusively confined to Albany, and it seems his patronage ring extended to nearby towns and villages. He is not the only elected Pinkster king cited in the source material. It seemed this was a common practice throughout the Hudson Valley. Robert J. Dam of Mississippi University cites of a celebration in Connecticut in his article entitled Pinkster. Dam uses the Negro Governors, Papers of the New Haven Historical Society, by Orville Platt for the following description. His parade days were marked by much that was showy, and by some things that were ludicrous. A troop of blacks, sometimes an 100 in number, marching sometimes 2 and 2 on foot, sometimes mounted in true military style and dress on horseback, escorted him through the streets with drums beating, colors flying, and fifes, fiddles, clarionets, and every sonorous metal that could be found, uttering martial sound, united in innocent and amusing fun and frolic, every voice upon its highest key, in all the various languages of Africa, mixed with broken and ludicrous English, filled the air, accompanied with the music of the fiddle, tambourine, the banjo, drum, etc. The whole body moved in the train of the governor-elect to his master's house, where, on their arrival, a treat was given by the gentleman newly elected, which ended the ceremonials of the day. Pinkster, as described in the above testimony, and from the period literature, was declining by the start of the 19th century. The percentage of African residents of Albany, for example, had dropped from almost 20% in 1790 to just 6% by 1820. Dutch religious attitudes tightened under the Pietist movement, and the American Revolution dramatically impacted both the political and social attitudes of the slaveholding class in New York. Waves of immigration from Europe and migration from New England diluted these syncretic Dutch traditions. Tensions over the schedule of emancipation, the Haitian Revolution, and economic competition between African Americans and recent immigrants forced change in law. First in 1804, Albany banned the attendance of white participants, and then banned the festival altogether in 1811. Shane White offers an interesting theory behind Albany's Anglo-Dutch sudden turning against the celebrations. He says that the slave participation had previously brought prestige to the great houses, but the Second Great Awakening introduced a level of religious prohibition against such merry-making. Dewulf also cites the festival as being sanctioned by the slave-owning class, which bestowed a certain degree of protection against outside meddling. The post-abolition era connection was broken, and the celebrations no longer had patrons high up in civil New York society. Instead, many of these events were seen as a threat post-Civil War by the white underclass. Since the 1970s, when the first revival festivities were held at Sleepy Hollow, many local and state efforts have been enacted to further research and preserve this incredible syncretic tradition. In 2010, New York Governor Patterson helped repeal the 1811 ban, and now the festival is once again celebrated from New York City to the Mohawk Valley. In this spirit, the Friends of Philipse Manor Hall invite you to the Manor this Saturday, May 10th, from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. for our own revival of this unique Hudson Valley tradition. Experience the sights and sounds of a lost Afro-Dutch culture brought to life on the land where it once thrived. Please help the Friends ensure this celebration continues long into our future and become a member today. You can find the membership link in the show notes. Thanks for listening to New York, Quebec, and the water route to the center of the world.